Hello and welcome to this Results Count webinar. I'm Bill Shepardson, a Senior Fellow in the Leadership Development Unit at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I'm going to walk you through some fundamental results count ideas and approaches today, with an emphasis on the framework we use to help leaders be more accountable for advancing equitable results. One of the key tenets of results count leadership, and you'll see this in just a moment, is that nothing important gets accomplished without a lot of people aligning their actions towards a shared result. So as we begin, I just want to quickly acknowledge the team that's responsible for creating and refining our approach. One of the things I love about this work is that it's alive and constantly improving, and these are the folks who are responsible for ensuring what we learn from leaders like yourselves inform the next iteration of our work. Let me give you a brief overview of the information I'll be sharing with you. I'm going to start with some context that situates results count as part of the Casey Foundation's efforts to advance equity, and I'm going to share some fundamentals about the approach. But then I'll spend the majority of the time walking you through a sequence that we believe helps leaders frame their own contribution to improving results for children, families, and communities, and lets them be accountable for aligning those contributions with others in ways that achieve equitable outcomes. The sequence is organized according to 4 core skills, and I'll explain how employing each of these skills helps create a path to equity. Our approach is designed to support the mission of the Casey Foundation, which is to ensure bright futures for all children living in the United States. And we believe the only way this really happens is when leaders from multiple systems align their actions in ways that make a measurable contribution to better results for all members of a defined population. And when we say all, we mean all. That requires a particular focus on those who are the furthest away from experiencing good results, those who you could say are actually most burdened by the way our current systems and structures operate and how they make opportunities available to people or how they don't. So as we get started, let me invite you to hold the work that you do on a day-to-day basis in mind as I walk through these slides and think about what application might look like and how it might strengthen your own ability to make powerful contribution to equity and get others working in concert with you. Here's the key question I'm asking you to consider. What are you willing to do to know that you're really, really making a difference? So ensuring all members of a defined population succeed requires relentless focus on equity, because all really does mean all. Focusing on equity is more than a value, it's actually instrumental to success. Working with leaders like yourselves around the country, we've learned a great deal about what this requires. First and foremost, it actually requires leaders to be able to distinguish between equity and equality. Equality means that everybody gets the same thing. That's equality. Equity actually requires that folks get what they need to be successful. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this graphic, but in the first picture, what you see here is equality. Everybody's got a box, and that box is intended to help them enjoy a particular result here or experience a particular result, and that's being able to see the ball game. And as you can see, that's not working out great for everybody involved. So that leads us to becoming fluent in the use of what our colleague John Powell would call targeted universalism. Targeted universalism actually requires a little bit more thinking about how people are currently situated in different structures and systems in this country and the impact that has on their ability to experience a good result. So in the second picture here, you see that there have been some targeted interventions, more boxes for folks who need them to see over the fence. But even that in itself isn't enough. If we are really serious about addressing the racialized policies and practices and behaviors, we're serious about disrupting the systems and structures that are actually leading to bad and often inequitable results as well, we believe leaders actually have to examine and attend to the historical and systemic factors that have produced and perpetuate those inequitable results. And in this example, that would actually lead to taking the fence down. That would be a systems move right there. The slide is labeled liberation, but you can see everybody can see the ball game at this point. So real quickly, our approach to leadership at the Casey Foundation is competency-based. That means we know it's not easy, but we believe it can be learned and practiced by leaders. Results Count is designed to help leaders develop a set of core competencies and practice the use of a couple of foundational frameworks in service of equitable results. So the sequence I'm going to walk you through speaks to the first two competencies, the ability to focus deeply on results in equity, but really all five are needed to be successful. This work requires leaders to lean in and take risks, to bring their whole selves to the work. It can be messy and adaptive, requiring people to change behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs, and it requires many, many people working together collaboratively. In addition, it requires aligned action. Um, this is a theory that was developed by our colleague Julie Pillsbury and provides a powerful set of principles you can hold in mind as you think about your work to advance equitable results. And the bottom line here is that equitable results for a whole population can't be achieved by one single organization or leader. They don't emerge from a single point of view, but rather they call on cross-sector leaders who hold multiple perspectives to join in making aligned contributions. There are several things that are important and can really drive your work. The first is having a powerful call to action. This happens when leaders place population-level results in the center of their work with a real sense of urgency, and their shared result becomes their North Star. Not the health of their organization, not their own leadership, but whatever it actually takes for them to achieve that result together. Second, it requires some deliberative work to create the conditions or environment that's needed for people to work together, the time, the place, and the tools that will allow a group of folks to accelerate progress together. And finally, it's really important to be intentional about the capacity to collaborate. This is where we link back to our results count skills and competencies. We actually believe that folks can develop and deepen their ability to do this, to hold individual and collective accountability, and work together to achieve better and more equitable results at the whole population level. A second key frame to hold in mind is what we call person-well system. Very simple to draw in three concentric circles, but a little tricky to put into action when you think about it. What this does is it invites you to think and strategize about what actions are needed at multiple levels. So long and short of it is this. We are all people, right? We're human beings, the sum total of our lived experience, and we bring ourselves, good, bad, and ugly, to any role we take up out in the world. How we take up our roles then out in the world influence how systems operate and the results that they produce. Systems are simply made up of people playing roles, and what we choose to do and what we choose not to do either allow systems to change and produce better and more equitable results or stay locked in place. And the transverse is true as well. Systems have written and unwritten rules, and how you perceive your system can either support your work powerfully or powerfully constrain what you are willing and able to do as a leader to make a contribution to more equitable results. How you experience your role over time changes who you are as a human, and how you act as a person. So using this analysis, really helpful, might help you understand what you actually need to do to take up your role super powerfully in service of equitable results, and what impact you might be having on the people you're trying to get into aligned action with. So role, being right in the middle of person and system, is really important. And this set of ideas, the boundary of authority, role, and task, or BIART, is a corollary of person-well system and really helps leaders be as clear as they can about the role they should be playing and the authority they need in order to make a powerful contribution day in and day out. So let's start with boundaries. Boundaries at their very best help provide clarity that people need to understand what it is they should be doing and what they're actually authorized to do moving forward. There are things like time, territory, task, the result itself. This clarity can be very helpful unless it becomes confining and prevents us from doing the right thing. But when boundaries are very, very blurry, we get ourselves in trouble as well. We tend to be stepping all over each other, we're duplicating efforts, and we're leaving important work undone. Authority is simply the right to do the work. There's formal authority that might come to you through an organization or a system, from your board, from your boss, and there's informal authority that you grant yourself and others grant you because you're good at what you do and you're effective. But the authority, the right to do work, needs to be clear as well, and it needs to be aligned with the role that you're playing. You need to have a particular amount of authority in order to play your role or function in any given system well. So your role itself does signify your function in any given system. And it should help you understand and be very clear about the kind of contributions you can make. If it's fuzzy, it turns out you can do just about anything on any given day, but you'll never be quite sure that you're making a powerful contribution and working with others to advance equitable results. Your primary tasks, if they're clearly aligned with your role and functions, means you're really doing the most important thing you can. If not, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this from time to time in your role, you can be working 24/7 without a sense that you're really making a powerful difference. This next slide shows you a worksheet that we offer leaders to really think about their BART, and I urge you to take a minute after the webinar to walk through these questions and reflect a little bit on the extent to which your own BART might be helping or holding you back in your pursuit of equity. One last word before I recap this intro and we step into the sequence and the 4 core skills. I just want to make the case that this is not purely technical work. It's very important that leaders get the results count sequence for being accountable for equitable results deeply into them so they can employ it with unconscious competence, like without thinking about it at all. But this is tough, messy, and countercultural work, and solutions aren't always known, right? We don't always know what we need to do here. Working for equity is an adaptive challenge. You're trying to change people's hearts, their minds, and how they act. And that requires the ability to slow down a little bit and observe events and patterns, to develop hypotheses about what's going on and what it will take to get people to act differently and in alignment, and then to keep trying different solutions until you hit upon ones that actually allow you to advance your strategies that are designed to produce equitable results. So as we step into the 4 core skills, let me just give you a moment to see how that falls on you and invite you to remember a couple things. First, work at the whole population level as equity work. All really does mean all, and it requires equal attention to everyone in the whole population as well as those who are furthest away from experiencing the result that you're seeking for them. Second, you need to be clear about your role and the authority that enables you to identify your most powerful contribution to equity and to join with others. And third, this approach can be learned and it can be practiced, but it's both technical and adaptive work. And you sort of have to be playing those 2 things simultaneously. Okay, I'm going to walk you through the 4 core skills one at a time. They build on one another. Hopefully you see that as we walk through. And what we have here really is a modified approach to using results-based accountability, methodology that was developed by our colleague Mark Friedman, and that we have adapted over the years through many, many interactions with leaders like yourselves to include a relentless focus on equity. But the bottom line is this. We believe if you can do these 4 things well and iteratively, that is, if you do them over and over and you take what you learn each time you go through the sequence, you can make your work stronger, you can make your work more effective, and you can dramatically strengthen the contribution you make to advancing equitable results. So let's start with skill 1. This is the ability to both differentiate and understand the connections between work done by multiple partners to deliver equitable results for all members of a defined population. It's what we would call a whole population. And to be clear about the contribution you make, the difference you as a leader can make that will benefit a subset of that larger whole population. To do this work well, you have to be clear and not conflate these 2 different things. Whole populations are members of a defined group in a particular geography or jurisdiction. And program populations are subsets of that larger population who are meant to benefit from a specific intervention, a slice of a larger strategy, something you or another leader could take on. Now, don't be fooled by the results-based accountability language here. Just because we're calling these program populations does not necessarily mean that they are being served by a formal program. In fact, because of the role that these multiple interlocking systems and structures play in producing racially inequitable results, we're pretty clear that programming alone is never going to be sufficient to get you to equitable results. So the kinds of interventions we're thinking about do include good programs, but they also include systems and policy change. They include community organizing and campaigns to produce greater public will, and they require structural changes. So when leaders can make this distinction, yet see the connection between what they're contributing and what it actually takes for multiple people to deliver equitable results for a whole population, they can actually work together to develop complex strategies that are designed to lead to equity for the whole population and still see and be accountable for their individual contributions to those larger efforts. Now, getting everyone to agree on what's going to make a difference is super tricky, and it's especially so in this day and age. What it requires is for leaders to be clear about who their work is meant to collectively benefit and what the common result that they're trying to achieve is. So the work to advance equitable results starts with a powerful result statement that leaders embrace and use to guide their work, and it's a relatively simple equation to come up with one. Clear definition of the population that you're focused on, place or geographic area to bound that, and then a strong and clear statement of the quality of life conditions that you're actually seeking or desiring for all members of the population. Here are a couple of examples. These are simple and easy to understand. They're elegant. The idea here is to motivate people to lean in and say, yes, that's my business. I have a role in making that happen. It's important to signal and sustain your focus on equity at all steps of this process, but it's really, really important in the beginning. Without a very explicit focus on equity and without explicit efforts to include the population you're working with and on behalf of, it's too easy to default to working on an aggregate level or thinking about things universally in ways that assume that all members of the population you're focusing on are similarly situated in terms of opportunity. So we encourage leaders to not just gather disaggregated data, but use that to identify inequities in terms of access to opportunity and disparate results, to uncover who's most burdened by the way systems and structures are currently operating, and also to work inclusively with those who are experiencing inequitable results to refine the result statement and indicators that you'll use to measure progress so that they're meaningful to that population as well, and they can join you in the effort to make sure that everybody is experiencing good and equitable results. Here we have a tool that we use with leaders that actually help them define their whole population and then understand where they can make their most powerful contribution. This tool also allows them to hold in mind target populations who are experiencing disparate results so they can remain front and center in the work. Now, it's both an art and a science to identify your whole population. What you're looking for is the largest population you can think of that's not so large that folks don't believe they can make a contribution. You want to motivate leaders to come together and have them still see that they can make a meaningful contribution that if taken together with lots of other leaders could add up in ways that would make a big difference for every member of the whole population. Let's look at a couple examples real quickly. This first one is an example that you would use to see what contribution a public system could make to a larger population. Sometimes this is easier to see since systems serve very defined populations. In this example, we are talking about a whole population that is all young people ages 0 to 26 in a state. And the result this group of leaders would be after here is that they're all experience educational success. That's a really large population. It's a really heavy lift to get to everybody in the state. So you can see using this tool, you can start to segment the population into smaller groups that different people at different levels of a system can focus on. And think about where it makes sense for them to make their most powerful contribution. So for instance, multiple partners at a city level can come together and say together, we're going to ensure education success for all young people 0 to 26 in our city. A smaller group of those partners might say, we actually, given our role and the way we understand our BIART, can focus on high school students in the city. And an even smaller group might say, we really need to focus our efforts on those high school students that are in danger of not graduating moving forward. And depending on what kind of role you play, if you're a teacher, an administrator, someone who works in a state education agency, a community partner, you can figure out where it makes most sense to focus your own effort. The other thing that this does is remind folks that no matter where they're making their contribution, they need to hold in mind a target population This is the population that when you disaggregate the data, you would see these are folks that are bearing the most burden of the way that systems are currently operating. In this case, the group did some disaggregation of the data. They took a look at it, and they found that African American boys and young men were faring the most poorly against an education result. I'll run to another example quickly that demonstrates how a different kind of organization can define and align its contribution. Many of the leaders that we work with, it turns out, don't directly touch the lives of kids or families. These are people that work in intermediaries, that do policy advocacy work, and it can be a little trickier for them to be clear about who benefits from their work. That said, it's just as important. These organizations theoretically have important contributions to make, they attract a lot of resources, and they need to be accountable for their impact. Often these folks are contributing to a huge whole population. They're national or statewide in scope, and that can be daunting, right? To think about how could I tell if what I'm doing is actually making a difference on such a large scale. So as people and leaders in these kinds of organizations make contributions, they need to be clear. Who are we influencing and activating? What difference will it make if we do a good job? And who will actually benefit from the actions we take? I'll run you through this example. This is a partner organization of ours, Strive Together, a national intermediary who works with communities across the country. But the population they're holding in mind as they do this are the 100 million 0 to 24-year-olds in this country. Strive Together seeks education and career success for these folks, and they use a cradle-to-career framework to get there. But an intermediary, as powerful as Strive Together is by itself, can't be on the hook for the success of 100 million people. So as Strive Together thinks about segmenting that population and where they make their most powerful contribution, they move from all U.S. communities to about 70 that are in their network that have made a common commitment to work together using a cradle-to-career framework. And you can see that's about a tenth of that 100 million 0 to 24-year-olds, 10.4 million in their network. And some of the work they do is targeted there, right, to those 70 communities who stand to benefit 10 million young people. They can segment even further, though, as they think about where they're really going to put the majority of their efforts. And Strive Together has 40 communities right now that they consider to be a pipeline, right? They're ready, they have increasing level of readiness to do the hard systems work that they believe it's going to take to ensure young people 0 to 24 in those 40 communities, that's about 6 million folks, 1.2 million of which are students of color, end up with education and career success moving forward. And finally, they can segment even further that of those 40, 24 are ready for some intense work with Strive Together and are willing to do some intense work on the ground to really transform those systems in ways that are going to make a difference for 3.6 million 0 to 24-year-olds, about 720,000 students of color. Segmenting like this allows the staff of Strive Together to really think about where am I putting my efforts, what am I doing, and keeping their eyes on the ultimate prize, which is that those 0 to 24-year-olds, particularly the students of color in those communities, are succeeding. So let me just recap real quickly. That was skill 1. We're going to move on to skill 2 in just a moment. But before we do that, take a moment, think about this, and think about your own work. Can you be clear about the whole population result you think you're making a contribution toward enroll? Do you or are you in the habit of paying attention to who within your whole population is currently most burdened and really thinking about what, in addition to what you might already be doing, you might need to do to ensure they experience equitable results? And what do you think would happen if you use BIART, right, to be really clear about your role, where your authority comes from, to determine what subset of the whole population your actions and contributions are meant to benefit, and then being willing to be on the line and accountable for whether that happens or not? All right, let's move on to skill 2 here, and this might require some quick translation. Skill 2 is using trend lines to deepen targeted and universal factor analysis. And what that means simply is leaders need to use a data-driven analysis to define the problem they're trying to solve, as well as what's currently working, the bright spots that they might have to build on. To do that, leaders need to define the key indicators that they will use to tell whether or not they are advancing equity, and then they need to get historical trend data on those indicators and disaggregate that data so they can conduct an analysis of what's been driving the trends over time for everybody and what accounts for the differentiated results for different subsets of the whole population. I'm sure you know, you'll get any data set in this country, you just aggregate it, you're going to see disparities by race. It's likely you'll see them by place, by gender, by all sorts of other categories, and you need to do the analysis both for the aggregate and for the different subgroups that are experiencing differential results. Let me start with an example. This is based on some work we did with leaders in Marion County, Indiana, that's Indianapolis. They were working, their whole population was formerly incarcerated adults in the county, and the result they wanted was that they were successfully reintegrated into their community when they came back from prison. They rolled up their sleeves and they looked at the data that would be available for their analysis so they could figure out what problem they were trying to solve and what bright spots they were trying to build on. And what they found were a couple of things, right? And just a quick word about these indicators. We tend in this country to collect data that says negative things about people instead of positive things about people, or at best talk about the absence of bad things happening to them. And sometimes that's just the best available data. We always encourage leaders to begin work with the best available data and then to create a data development agenda to get better data over time to inform their efforts. So in this case, they were able to gather data on the population they cared about that had to do with recidivism and rearrest within the prior year. And they took a look at the trends over time. What's actually been happening to these trend lines? And as you can see, looking at these two graphs, the trends were pretty flat. They weren't making a lot of progress over time. Second thing they did was ask themselves, what's likely to happen if we keep on doing what we've been doing, if we just kind of go on our merry way? And they figured that the trends would stay pretty flat, right? They wouldn't see a lot of change. They asked themselves if that was okay. The answer was no. And what they did was set some targets for themselves, right, to bend the curve so that they were moving faster and more intentionally in the right direction over time, and then began the analysis that they needed to do to figure out how they would make that happen. These next three slides simply show you how important it is to adopt a baseline, to think about what would happen if the people just did whatever they're doing, what would happen to the trend, and then to set a target for getting better over time. So once you've set a target, you can get busy figuring out what it will take to achieve it. Now, I have to be honest with you, this is a step many leaders feel they can skip. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We're all experts. The reason we're in our jobs is because people believe we know what needs to happen to produce better and more equitable results. We all feel the urgency. We can't take a lot of time and wait around and lose another generation of folks. But in the end, the results we're getting by doing what we're doing are the results we're getting, and there are very few of us that are happy or that are satisfied, right? And that see that we're making a powerful contribution and can say with a straight face, we're delivering equitable results. So slowing down and engaging in this sort of data-driven analysis can have a big payoff. You want to start with the best available data you have. You want to have other data at your fingertips to help understand what's going on. We encourage leaders to use quantitative data, to use qualitative data, and to consider the lived experience of folks in the population they're working with and on behalf of. But if you do this well, this data-driven analysis can shape your theory of action, right? Can actually create a commonly held sense that if we address these particular factors, specific changes will happen and that will lead to more equitable results. They dictate our highest priority actions. What are we going to do more of? What are we going to do less of? Where are our time, effort, and money going to go? And they allow you to get to the root of the problem and stop just addressing symptoms of deeper problems, as well as push past your own default thinking about what needs to happen and consider other possibilities. As leaders move into this analysis, we usually invite them to take the time to examine how their own identity and experience is going to influence the conclusions they come to. We all stand at different points in systems, and we all see different things from that vantage point, and it's all based on who we are. For good or bad, we all have what in our work we call mental models, but these are frameworks or stories we have that we tell ourselves so we can understand the way the world works. To make things even more complicated, our brains are actually quite lazy and make super quick associations. By quick, I mean almost instantaneous, that we may or may not be aware of. These quick associations guide what we think and how we make decisions and draw conclusions, but we're not always in touch with them. Our brains are big distortion making machines, as it turns out, and there's a good reason for that. It helps us make sense of enormous amounts of data in very short amount of time, and helps us figure out as humans how to survive. Think about what happens to you when you're driving and you see a blue light out of the corner of your eye. You immediately assume it's the police and something's going on. You usually get a little burst of adrenaline and you slow down. May have been a blue neon sign, may have been a flashing light. Same thing when you see a snake. When I see a snake anyway, I jump. That's probably a good thing because some snakes are venomous, but some aren't, right? So you can see how these quick associations, snake bad, blue light police, often are good and they serve us well, but often can lead us to erroneous conclusions as well. And this is particularly true when we think about racial and other kinds of disparities, because whether we know it or not, we've all been primed to have narratives about why these disparities exist. And those narratives are unfortunately often shaped and influenced by pernicious stereotypes and a host of untruths. When we're aware we're making these associations, we would call that explicit bias if we don't challenge or change our mind. When we're unaware that we're making these associations, we call that implicit bias. And implicit bias actually can be uncovered, and we can change the way our brains make these associations and the way we make decisions. We just have to make the effort, and we've got to slow down to do it. Next couple of slides simply show you the steps of factor analysis. What you're doing here is trying to work to figure out what's been helping and hurting in the past, so you can use that analysis to figure out what you need to do in the future. And it's very important to dig deep and get down to root causes, so your eventual interventions are working at multiple levels and not just addressing the symptoms of deeper, more systemic problems. So remember, you want to identify factors that have been moving a trend in the right direction and those that have been restricting it, right? Not allowing it to move as quickly or as powerfully in the direction you want. And just encourage folks, don't forget the things that are moving the trend in the right direction. We're often way better at identifying problems and going to work on those problems than we are of recognizing bright spots, things that are working. So encourage you to really take the time to build on what might be working at a small scale and using your analysis to think about how those things might be amplified in ways that lead to more equitable results. Another thing to keep in mind is systems thinking. We encourage leaders to use systems thinking to dig deep in this analysis. And here's why. If you keep your analysis at the event level, and that's the easiest because it's what's seen, it's the easiest to measure. What happened? How many times did it happen? You can tell what happened, but you can't really tell why it was a good thing or why it was a bad thing. To do that, you have to understand the patterns of behavior that emerge during those events and figure out which of those patterns lead to better and more equitable results and which ones might be preventing them. Thinking even more deeply, those patterns of behavior are often highly influenced by how systems are structured and what they demand of folks, what they ask of folks, what they reward folks for doing. And the systems of structures remain locked into place. Remember, when we were looking at the BIART and person role system slide, systems are kept in place by how people take up their roles. The mental models people hold, assumptions and beliefs about that system, why it exists, what it's meant to do, actually can either keep the structure of a system in place, whether it's producing good or bad results, or it can actually, mental models can be used to drive changes in the structure of the system. The system is not working the way it's supposed to. I'll give you a very quick example drawn from the workforce world. At the event level, all sorts of things are going on to try to help connect people to jobs. There are job fairs, job searches, there are case managers, there are coaches interacting with folks on a day-to-day basis. But what actually occurs in those interactions, in those events, is deeply influenced by how people behave. Are they pushing folks to work to take the very first job that comes along? Are they setting them at computers saying, here are a bunch of job listings, sink or swim? Um, or are they coaching folks? Are they focusing on building soft skills that folks might need to get to employment? Are they providing peer support once folks are placed into jobs? This really matters. And as I said earlier, it's often highly influenced by the system structure. What is the system asking folks to do? How is it asking them to behave? So a system its highest goal is the number of placements are going to push people to work very quickly. Even if they place the same person in 3 or 4 jobs in the course of a year, that's a win for them. They get to count 3 or 4 job placements. Whereas a system that rewards folks for getting and keeping jobs that pay enough to support a family um, probably tend more towards soft skills, peer coaching, on-ramps to certain industries that pay well. And that's all driven, right, by the mental models underlying the systems. If the folks who run the system believe that folks who aren't working are lazy and just need to get to work, that everybody has to work, I have to work, I don't love my job, um, they're likely to keep a structure in place that pushes people to immediate placement. If the mental models underlying the system, on the other hand, are we really need to account for how the education system and the employment system in the past has failed individuals, they are far more likely to engage in the patterns of behavior that lead folks to be able to get and keep family supporting wage jobs. Here's an example of factor analysis for you to take a look at it. Um, After the webinar, you might want to look at this a little more deeply. It's the first pass from a group of folks that we were working with who were analyzing what it would take to make sure young people were not disconnected from work and school. And it's a pretty good pass, but if you look closely, you'll notice that they are still sort of working to identify factors at multiple levels of the system. The next step in factor analysis is to repeat what you have just done for the whole population for targeted subpopulations. And this is where leaders get serious if they believe all means all as well. You need to establish baselines and targets for those who are most burdened, those who are experiencing the worst results, the subsets of your whole population, and then conduct an analysis to account for the factors that have created those disparities, those differential results. My favorite analogy for this, folks, is that when you're working at the whole population level and you're sort of coming up with universally what are the things that are driving good and bad outcomes for folks, it's almost like you are trying to speed up an escalator. You are trying to get people more quickly to a desired result. But when you disaggregate the data and find that folks are starting in different places, what you actually have are folks that are at all different positions on the escalator, some maybe 20, 50 steps back. And simply speeding up the escalator is going to do nothing to change those gaps, right, to move folks more quickly up the steps so they all arrive at their destination at the same time. This targeted analysis, right, why are some people starting 20 steps behind? Why are some people starting 50 steps behind is crucial to understanding what it will take to both speed up the escalator and get folks moving up those steps so they all end up experiencing the same high quality of results. And here is an example from the same group of a targeted factor analysis. So these folks, when they disaggregated their data, noticed that pregnant and parenting young women were faring worse than other folks in their whole population, and set out to come up with a set of targeted factors that they believe accounted for the difference in outcomes those young women were experiencing. The idea here is that your analysis yields factors that, if addressed, would allow you to achieve the same level of results for everyone in your whole population, and not just settle for speeding up the escalator while doing nothing to address the gaps. The next couple of slides walk you through targeted and universal factor analysis in more detail. I'd urge you to take a look at this after the webinar and really think about how you might integrate this into your own practice. You may be doing some or all of these things, just not in a super intentional way. Or this might be a methodology you want to think about how to apply to your own efforts to figure out what the most powerful contribution you should be making is. I'll give you one more example of powerful factor analysis. This is from a cross-sector group that wanted to be clear about what leads to homelessness and the magnitude of those different factors, like how much does being evicted matter? How much does abuse at home matter? So that they could be sure they were addressing all the most important ones as they set to collectively put in motion a set of strategies that they believed would dramatically lower homelessness, the incidence of homelessness over time. And before I recap skill number 2, I just want to loop back around and remind you one more time of the importance of taking the time and having the courage to identify mental models that are shaping your understanding of the problems you're trying to solve and the strengths you believe you have to build on. And quite frankly, to get comfortable doubting your own analysis. I know we all like to believe we have a corner on reality. It's one of the things that make us experts and good at what we do. But our analyses are never as empirical as we believe they are, and we need to be open to other points of view as we think about what needs to be addressed in order to achieve equitable results. So skill 2, just take a moment, think about how that fell on you. What would happen if you were to slow down before moving to action and do a careful analysis of the problem you're trying to solve using disaggregated data so that you could identify both universal and targeted factors? What might be different if you set up the process so you heard from and had to consider multiple perspectives and point of views about the factors that needed to be addressed? If you really reflected on the impact of mental models in driving your preferences about what work you choose to do, what strategies you think are successful, and what might happen if you were in the habit of doubting your own analysis and listening openly to other people's points of view. Move us into skill 3. And this is actually using your factor analysis and adding to that additional systems thinking and equity thinking to make sure you develop a powerful set of both targeted and universal strategies. You would be surprised at how many leaders we see go through the process of factor analysis and then jump right back into doing what they were doing before. It's the way we're wired. It's the way we're rewarded right now. I've said a couple times this is countercultural work, but it only makes a difference if you're willing to then build on your factor analysis to inform what it is you're going to do and what you're going to ask others to do as they join with you. Very important then to use your factor analysis to really ensure things are getting prioritized and done differently. You're likely, after running through a factor analysis, to have a lot of factors, so you need to prioritize them. And the key question you want to ask yourself is, what handful of factors, if we address them, are really going to make the biggest difference? Here's a nice example from Baltimore, cross-sector group of folks in the city, very concerned about infant mortality. Tried to figure out what is it that we're not doing that we need to do better, that we need to do more of. And their factor analysis yielded a lot of potential causes that were driving infant mortality in the wrong direction in the city of Baltimore, but they were able to prioritize 3 that seemed really powerful and really actionable. And by developing a set of strategies that focused on premature birth, low birth weight, and unsafe sleep, they've been able to make really great strides in driving down infant mortality in the city. Collective action, everybody knows what their contribution and role is, and they're all trying to address the same factors. So a word about strategies. Strategies are not single or individual actions that individual leaders can take. They're the overarching approach, right? A whole set of coherent actions and activities that multiple people can implement together in order to move towards equitable results. An analogy we love to use in our program are that is thinking of strategies as a quiver full of arrows, right? The quiver itself and the arrows together comprise a rich and nuanced strategy that might actually make a difference. Each of the arrows become activities or interventions, right, that are parts or subparts of the strategy. And this analogy really lets you think carefully about making sure that your strategies have components at all levels of the system. Some might be directed at changing patterns of behavior. Some might be about restructuring systems to support more effective behavior, to support the kind of interventions that lead to more equitable results. And some of them probably need to be targeted at shifting mental models. So those folks are actually motivated and able to change the structure of the system and change their own patterns of behavior that might be highly influenced by a set of mental models that are not helpful to their efforts. This slide shows you a worksheet that you can use. If you have any current strategies in play, you might want to take a moment after the webinar and map this out to see how closely, right, the work you're doing mirrors this thinking of being driven by data-driven analysis and using systems thinking. And I would also encourage you to think really carefully about strategy criteria when you're trying to make a decision or a call of where you're going to put your efforts and where you're going to ask partners and others to join you. These are criteria that we have developed over years with leaders out in the field based on what they find leads to the development of strategies that really make a difference. The first one, really obvious, that you want your strategies to be informed by your factor analysis, and you want to prioritize, right, and really make sure that you are responding to the most important universal and targeted factors. This is where you don't want to default to universal strategies after you've done a targeted analysis. We encourage leaders to conduct an intentional racial impact analysis, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, to make sure their strategies are working at multiple levels and reflecting systems thinking, that the strategies themselves are actionable. Folks, you've got to either have the capacity to implement the strategy, or you have to have it wired into the strategy to quickly build the capacity that's needed. You want your strategies to match the magnitude of your aspirations. So what's the scale of results you're hoping to achieve? You want your strategies to be informed by evidence, the best available evidence, data, and experience. And you want them to be realistic and future focused. You really have to think about the social, economic, and political environment and how that may change over time. It's like making sure there's fallow ground and your strategies don't wither on the vine because the moment was not right or ripe to push that work forward. So here are some questions that leaders we work with have found to be very helpful in trying to ensure that once they develop a strategy, they have not lost or dropped their thinking about targeted factors and their commitment and aspiration around equity. I encourage you to think about and use these. Again, you could apply them to current strategies that you're working, and to really think through the unintended consequences very, very carefully. I'll tell you a very quick story that there have been efforts all around the country at different points in time to reduce class size for kids in elementary school. There's great research that shows that a lower student-teacher ratio leads to better outcomes for young kids. In many of the places they've implemented those policies, however, it has had the opposite effect on low-income kids of color, because the unintended consequence is that it creates a teacher shortage for elementary school teachers and enables higher paying districts with easier kids to draw the most qualified teachers, to pay them higher salaries, and often results in school districts where there are a lot of low-income kids of color getting less experience and less effective teachers teaching them, and thus does not have the desired effect moving forward. Next couple of slides show you a tool that you can use to assess your strategies against the criteria. There's a blank chart that you can use if this feels like it would be helpful to you, and then an example of a group that actually took a strategy they had developed and went and tried to say whether it's high, medium, or low in meeting the criteria in a particular way. So what's important to remember here for skill 3 is that if you're using this approach, this methodology, and this pathway to achieve equity, you've got to ensure your strategies address both universal and targeted factors. You're going to want to use a racial equity analysis to be as clear as possible about your hypothesis of how it will lead to more racially equitable results and not have unintended consequences. You're going to want to test your strategies to see if there are components of them that are aimed at different levels of the system iceberg. So you're working on mental models, systems change, behavior change, all at the same time. And you want to make sure that your strategies are described clearly and are actionable so that people can see where they fit, right? You're not having a fuzzy, oh, we'll have a communication strategy, which could mean anything to anybody, but person X needs to communicate with person Y on a regular basis. That could be a component of a strategy that's very clear, and person X and person Y would know exactly what their roles were in taking up that strategy. All right, let's move on to skill 4. We're in the home stretch here. And this is really, we find working with leaders around the country where the rubber meets the road. This skill enables leaders to define the most important contribution they can make once strategies have been developed, to ask themselves the question, like, what part is mine? Where is my accountability in the larger strategies? And then to develop and use performance measures so they can learn about whether and how they're making a difference and whether and how they're contributing to equitable results. Having a set of metrics like this also enables leaders to be far more transparently accountable for their own contribution that many of us are used to doing. And we believe that's a really good and helpful thing to get into the habit of normalizing accountability so it becomes learning. And you can go back to the drawing board and keep trying stuff until you're actually making a measurable difference for everyone. So having and using performance measures, crucial if a little scary for leaders. Right. Do all the things I was talking about here. You can develop and test a working hypothesis about the most powerful contribution you can make in role. And if you were wrong, you can go back and figure out what you need to try differently in order to make a more powerful contribution. Performance measures in this framework help leaders know 4 things and answer 4 really important questions. Did I do what I said I was going to do? Did I do it well? Did it make the difference I thought it would? Right? Did it result in the changes in systems, policy, practice, behavior I thought it would if I did it and I did it well? And the most important, if all those things have happened, I did the work well, I see early signs that it's changing systems and practice, the most important question is anybody better off as a result? Here are some key questions you can ask yourself when you're trying to figure out both what your contribution to a strategy should be and how you're going to know once you take up that contribution whether you're being effective or not. We always encourage leaders to work backwards from what subset of the whole population is going to be better off and how you'll know it. We encourage folks then to have some interim milestones, the things that you believe actually need to happen on the way to those better off results for a subset of the whole population, to make sure that all parts of the strategy are covered. Right? You need to break your strategies down into subcomponents. So leaders in charge of those different components are clear on what their contribution needs to be, and they can develop metrics to know whether or not they're making a powerful contribution. Let me walk through this process with you just a little more slowly so you can see the application. Remember the egg chart? You can actually use this to guide your thinking about the subset of the larger whole population that you believe you're responsible for making better off, and to guide your thinking about your better off performance measures. Every strategy needs a set of better off and difference made performance measures. If the strategy is fully implemented and it's implemented well, everybody's playing their part and we're firing on all cylinders. What will be different in terms of the system, in terms of policy, in terms of the behaviors? And if all those differences are made, who's going to be better off? Get a little theory of action. If we do this work, we do it well, we're going to see important systems changes, and eventually we're going to see that people are doing better. So in this example, you can see that the better off measures came directly from the segmentation in the egg chart, that folks are really interested in this case in making sure that older youth in foster care get high school diplomas and that they're in stable placements. Those are both proxies, right? Proxy for education success and proxy for having stable and helpful connections to caring adults moving forward. You can see that this strategy also has a difference made measure, that the folks who did the data-driven analysis and came up with strategies here believe that creating equitable discipline policies in school districts are essential to those things happening, those better off measures being achieved. So just another graphic here. Segmented egg chart leads you to think of who am I really focusing on, and then not losing the focus on your target population. So in this case, and these are drawn from real work that a group that we've recently worked with did, they're not only now interested in the number and percent of youth in foster care with a high school diploma, but they want to make sure that high school-aged African-American boys are actually achieving those rates at high levels in ways that set them up for success. And the same thing with placements. They don't just want overall increase in stable placements. They want to see equitable increases in stable placements that benefit African American boys as well as other young people in the foster care system. Another way to think about this, all right, is once you're clear about your better off and difference made measures, you can begin to add additional measures about your strategy. How much do we need to do? How well do we need to do it? And one way to do that is to break a strategy down into components. So same strategy, same example we've been working here. Strategy to ensure youth in foster care graduate from high school. You see the difference made and better off measures that the group came up with. And they realized that there were several components of the strategy. They had to think about advocacy. They had to be doing something very intentional to stabilize placements. They thought providing wraparound supports might be a way to keep young people in school, to keep them enthusiastic and connected. And they wanted to really push their thinking about ensuring young people in foster care had connections to caring adults who could help them with their education success as well. Each of those subcomponents then has its own set of performance measures, right? Because you need to know, is our advocacy working? Is our efforts to stabilize placements working, et cetera? And the group was able to move from what looks like a lot of performance measures to a coherent set of headline measures for the strategy. So you notice they took a few important ones from the measures they had developed for each of the subcomponents and came up with a data dashboard that a whole group of folks working together could monitor and pay attention to, and support one another and hold one another accountable as they thought about, are we doing what we said we were going to do, really stepping up to our hypothesis? Are we doing it in a way that we actually think it will lead to the difference made we need to see? And in the end, are we seeing a sub-part of our whole population better off, in this case, youth in foster care? One thing I encourage you to remember here is, this is almost back to skill one. We've almost gone full circle here, that you need to keep your thinking about contribution and your performance measures as aligned as possible with the work you're doing at the whole population level and the indicators you're using to measure the well-being and success of that larger population. So you'll note here, this example I've been running with you all, the big result at the whole population level folks were working on was education success for all young people, not just young people in foster care. The indicators they were using were high school graduation and enrollment and post-secondary education. And you'll notice, right, that in this final version of their data dashboard, their better off measures are very closely aligned with the indicators they were using. But they have a set of finer measures, right? They don't have to wait years to find out if they're making a difference at the whole population level. They can, in a relatively short amount of time, a single measurement cycle, say, did we do what we said we were going to do? Did we do it well? Did it lead to the difference we anticipated? And did that difference in turn create the conditions that led to more equitable results for real people out in the world? As you think about application to your own work, I would offer you some criteria. If you're serious about using performance measures, you want them to be powerful. First and foremost, you've got to make sure that they continue to speak to your aspirations around equity. They've got to be clear, and you've got to be able to actually measure things and get your hands on the data moving forward. Before we recap Skill 4 and close out the webinar, let me leave you with a graphic and schematic that you can use to check your work, right? As you walk through the sequence, you can walk backwards from the equitable result you're after to contribution at the individual leader level and the performance measures they would need, and you can sort of walk it the other way as well to say, if we do these things and our performance measures say it's working, we will have successfully taken up different subcomponents of our strategies. It means our strategy is working, it's really addressing key factors, and we see movement towards our targets at the whole population level. This is why the webinar is called Pathway to Equitable Results, because we really do believe that you begin with backwards mapping, but what you end up with is a path forward, a powerful hypothesis that can be tested with data about what it's really going to take for multiple leaders to come together and do something different in ways that lead to better and more equitable results. So for Skill 4, a couple of closing thoughts, things I would encourage you to think about. Start with the end in mind, even at this level, right? Who is the subset of the whole population that will benefit from your contribution, whether you're a service provider and you're standing right with kids and families, or you are a national intermediary and it seems like you're very, very far away. To keep your aspirations around equity in mind when you're framing your contribution. It's easy at this point to slip back into thinking that you can make a contribution that is sort of universal and hits the big middle without really thinking about the targeted actions you need to take and how you would measure those to ensure that you're pushing for equity as well. And to be really clear about how you're going to use your performance measures, right? The ideal use is for learning and accountability, not gotcha stuff, not taking people's resources away from them, but to really figure out what's working, what's not working, what do we want to do more of, and what are we missing here in our pursuit of equity. So if you're still listening, I would imagine this has piqued your curiosity in some way, and you're curious about how you might apply it to your own work. There are several resources we can offer you. You can certainly listen to this webinar again, or parts of it, if you just wanted to listen to Skill 1 or the setup. We have a series of videos, short, easy to digest videos on YouTube that you can search for. There's one about personal system, there's one about BIART, some that help you really think more deeply about the adaptive nature of the work. We have an e-newsletter that will keep you up to date about what's going on in Casey's leadership development system and our network with leaders out there in the world, and a lot of information on the Casey website as well. And the last thing I just invite you to do is a little reflection, right? As you digest the information I shared with you, just think about these questions. How closely does the results count approach mirror your current practice? You may be doing some of this stuff intuitively. You may be doing parts. There may be parts of the work, right, that you're like, oh, I could build on that, right? I'm already doing part of it. Think about how you can ensure your contribution is connected to a larger strategy. And how, by doing that, by connecting your work to a larger strategy that's known to yourself and other leaders, how much more likely is it that what you do will help produce equitable results for a whole population? Think about how much more powerful your contribution could be if it was consistently grounded in a data-driven and equity-formed analysis. This is not skipping over the analysis part. I know what to do. There's too much urgency, but slowing down. And how could using a set of performance measures help you learn about and be more accountable for contributing to equitable results? And so in closing, folks, if there are only a few things you take away from the webinar, I would offer these to remember. There is some learning here. There are some technical skills you can name and practice, but this work is also messy, adaptive, and tough. It's not for the faint of heart. But marrying your passion for doing this with more discipline around a data-driven approach is the best way we know to up your game and increase the likelihood that you are contributing to better outcomes and more equitable results for kids and families. So thanks very much for listening, and I wish you the best of luck in applying these ideas to your efforts to advance equitable results.